Few statements have the ability to enrage both conservatives and liberals alike. Barack Obama was the greatest Republican president of my lifetime. Now understand, I'm not just trying to be inflammatory here. This is something I genuinely believe, but it requires a pretty detailed explanation. And the reason I think it's important to put this out there is because our country is having an existential crisis under authoritarian rule, and it's obscuring our judgment at a critical juncture. The guy who's in there today is there because of the perceived and real failures of the Obama administration. If not for this era, there is no Trump 1.0. Trump 2.0 is on Biden, Harris, Schumer, and every other Democrat living in an alternate reality. But if we're to move past the Trump era once and for all at some point, we have to be honest about how far the Overton window has shifted to the right in this country. So in my mind, there's no better example than how people feel about Barack Obama.
UNFTR.
When we think of the Republican Party, I mean the one that existed before Trump took that ride on the escalator. Nope, not that one. Hang on. Yep, that's the one. The Republican Party stood for certain things, certain values, even if they were no longer true and were just shibboleths in political culture. But before Trump, if you asked people what the party stood for, they'd probably say things like family values and Christian morals. Republicans are the ones who are tough on crime and in favor of a secure border and strong military. They believe in corporate America and free markets, low taxes and less regulation. And they are the party of fiscal responsibility and hot dogs. And so before we go through this whole exercise, let's just put a few things out there about President Obama. President Obama is a family man, through and through. He's a devout Christian who guided the White House for 8 years without scandal. Under Obama, the border was more secure than any president before him. He prosecuted wars in Afghanistan and Iraq, oversaw regime change in Libya, carried out bombing campaigns in Pakistan, Yemen, and Somalia, captured and killed Osama bin Laden. He kept taxes low for corporations and even maintained the Bush-era tax cuts for individuals. And after the bailout of the economy that had collapsed under his predecessor, he was responsible for cutting the budget deficit 5 out of his 8 years in office. His biggest scandal, of course, was disrespecting the office of the president by wearing a tan suit. No, not that one, this one. So there we go. Am I being selective? A little. But are all these statements of fact? Absolutely. So the first thing to understand about our media culture is that had Barack Obama been a Republican, and let's face it, a white guy, Fox News would still be touting him as though he was the second coming of Ronald Reagan and saying that these were the good old days. Instead, MSNBC touts him as though he's the second coming of JFK, who also wasn't very liberal, mind you. So these force-fed narratives have destroyed our critical thinking skills, which is why it's a great time to authentically evaluate Obama's tenure and legacy. It's far enough behind us to understand the ramifications of Obama-era policies, but close enough to compare the man himself to the guy that we have now. We need to somehow live in a more objective reality, so this is as good of a place to start as any. When Barack Obama left office, my kids were 7 and 10. So they really have no relationship to the Obama presidency. And now they're of voting age, which means that their frame of reference is Joe Biden and Donald Trump. These are their base cases. So on the one hand, I can't imagine a scenario where literally any sane person who can form a coherent sentence will look like a fucking genius. On the other hand, if we keep trotting out awful candidates, they'll just assume that that's what this is. Each party just finds the worst option they have, and the lesser of them gets to be president. But looking back at Romney, McCain, Obama, Hillary, John Kerry, seems like an embarrassment of riches these days. Now, I'll argue that even these candidates appear along a spectrum that runs from center-right to conservative. And to illustrate the point here, we'll go through the primary achievements of the Obama administration from a liberal and conservative perspective, understanding that nothing that a black man in this or any position does will ever win over a far-right evangelical Christian in this country. So then, when we finish, I'm going to offer a progressive take on the very same scorecard. So let's set some ground rules for this. First off, I'm not going to talk about the tan suit or Benghazi. If you think that these were legitimate scandals, you are on the wrong channel. Instead, we're going to roll through the signature policy achievements of the administration and give the bifurcated liberal establishment view of them and the conservative take to illustrate the manufactured nature of our media culture. So we're going to look at the Affordable Care Act, or Obamacare, the wars in Iraq and Afghanistan, the global financial crisis response and recovery, Paris Climate Accord, Iran nuclear deal, DACA protections, and general fiscal management. So this is by no means an exhaustive list. And in fact, there are seminal policies that I've omitted that if you want to defend or rebuke, have at it in the comments. So let's start with what most consider to be the signature and generational policy achievement of the Obama White House, Obamacare. The Affordable Care Act, signed into law in 2010, represented the most significant overhaul of American healthcare since Medicare. The legislation expanded Medicaid, created insurance marketplaces, prohibited denial of coverage for pre-existing conditions, and included an individual mandate requiring most Americans to obtain health insurance or pay a penalty. So the liberal establishment view is that this was a historic achievement that extended health coverage to millions of previously uninsured Americans and protected those with pre-existing conditions from discrimination. It represented the first successful major healthcare reform in generations and laid the foundation for future improvements to the system. And despite Republican obstruction, Obama delivered on a promise that Democrats had been trying to fulfill for decades. Now, the conservative view was that Obamacare represented pure government overreach that forced Americans to buy a product that they didn't want, and it destroyed the free market healthcare system. The individual mandate was unconstitutional infringement. Now, the conservative view was that Obamacare was pure government overreach that forced Americans to buy a product they didn't want, and it destroyed the free market healthcare system. The individual mandate was an unconstitutional infringement on personal liberty, and the program led to higher premiums and deductibles for middle-class families. It represented a massive expansion of federal power and was passed through legislative manipulation without bipartisan support. Barack Obama inherited two ongoing wars from the Bush administration. He withdrew most combat troops from Iraq by 2011, though troops did have to return in 2014 to fight ISIS. In Afghanistan, he initially surged troop levels before beginning a drawdown. The operation that killed Osama bin Laden in 2011 was a defining moment of his presidency. Now, the liberal establishment view was that Obama responsibly ended the disastrous Iraq war that Bush started while taking the fight to al-Qaeda leadership through strategic operations. The bin Laden raid showed decisive leadership and fulfilled the promise to America after 9/11. The use of targeted strikes and special operations reduced American casualties while keeping pressure on terrorist networks. He navigated an impossible situation created by his predecessor and brought most of the troops home. Now, the conservative view is that Obama's precipitous withdrawal from Iraq created the vacuum that allowed ISIS to flourish, destabilizing the entire region. His lead-from-behind approach in Libya was a disaster, and his arbitrary timetables for withdrawal emboldened American enemies. While the bin Laden raid was successful, he deserves no special credit for completing the mission that Bush's policies made possible. His over-reliance on drones without clear strategy showed weakness on the world stage. Obama took office in January 2009 amid the worst economic crisis since the Great Depression. His administration implemented the American Recovery and Reinvestment Act, a $787 billion stimulus package, and oversaw the auto industry bailout as an example. The administration also implemented the Troubled Asset Relief Program, or TARP, even though this was initiated under Bush. So the liberal view is that Obama saved the country from a second Great Depression through swift action and smart economic policy. The stimulus prevented total economic collapse. The auto bailout saved millions of jobs, and his steady leadership restored confidence in American markets. Wall Street and Main Street both recovered under his watch, with the longest streak of job growth in American history, and by the end of his presidency, unemployment had dropped from 10% to under 5%, and the stock market had more than doubled. The conservative view is that Obama's response to the crisis expanded government to unprecedented levels and rewarded the very institutions that caused the problem. The stimulus was wasteful spending that ballooned the deficit without creating lasting economic growth, and the auto bailout rewarded union bosses while taxpayers footed the bill. His policies created regulatory burdens that slowed recovery, and his anti-business rhetoric deterred investment. The recovery was the slowest on record despite massive government intervention. In 2015, Obama helped broker the Paris Climate Agreement, an international treaty bringing together 195 countries to combat climate change. And the agreement set goals for reducing greenhouse gas emissions and limiting global temperature increases. The liberal establishment view was that the Paris Agreement represented unprecedented global cooperation on the existential threat of climate change. Obama provided crucial leadership in bringing together nations to address a crisis that requires collective action, positioning America as a leader in the transition to clean energy. It demonstrated that multilateral diplomacy can achieve results on complex global challenges. The agreement helped give hope to humanity that we could unite to prevent environmental catastrophe. The conservative view was that the Paris Agreement was a job-killing agreement that hurt American businesses while giving China and other polluters a free pass. It represented Obama's willingness to subordinate American sovereignty to international bodies and unelected bureaucrats. The agreement would have destroyed the coal industry and raised energy costs for families without meaningful impact on global temperature. It was just another example of virtue signaling that punished the American worker. The Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action reached in 2015 aimed to prevent Iran from developing nuclear weapons. Under the agreement, Iran accepted the limits on its nuclear program and international inspections in exchange for relief from economic sanctions. Okay, so the liberal view is that the Iran deal prevented a nuclear-armed Iran through diplomacy rather than military action, avoiding another disastrous Middle East war. It brought Iran's nuclear program under unprecedented international oversight and demonstrated that tough negotiations can achieve security goals. He showed that patient diplomacy, backed by sanctions pressure, could resolve seemingly intractable conflicts. The alternative was an Iranian bomb or another war. So conservatives say that Obama gave billions to the world's leading state sponsor of terrorism while getting nothing in return. The sunset clauses guaranteed that Iran would eventually get nuclear weapons anyway, and the regime used sanctions relief to fund terror networks across the Middle East. The deal emboldened Iranian aggression in Syria, Yemen, and Iraq, while abandoning American allies like Israel and Saudi Arabia. It was an appeasement that made the world more dangerous. In 2012, Obama announced Deferred Action for Childhood Arrivals, which protected from deportation undocumented immigrants who came to the U.S. as children. The program allowed approximately 800,000 young people to obtain work permits and continue their education without fear of removal. So the liberal establishment view is that DACA was a compassionate response to a humanitarian crisis, protecting young people who grew up in America and knew no other home. Obama showed moral leadership when Congress failed to act on immigration reform, providing security to dreamers who contribute to our economy and our communities. It was just the right thing to do for people who came through no fault of their own. The program demonstrated American values of opportunity and fairness. Conservatives, mind you, think that DACA was an unconstitutional executive overreach example that granted amnesty to illegal immigrants and encouraged more illegal immigration. Obama couldn't pass legislation, so he acted like a king and created law by executive fiat, setting a dangerous precedent. It rewarded lawbreaking and jumped the line ahead of legal immigrants who were waiting to enter the country. The program proved that Democrats prioritize illegal aliens over American citizens. Obama reduced the federal deficit by roughly two-thirds during his presidency, from $1.4 trillion in 2009 to $585 billion in 2016. However, the national debt nearly doubled from $10 trillion to $19.9 trillion. The liberal view is that Obama cut the deficit faster than any president in modern history while still investing in economic recovery and infrastructure. He responsibly balanced the need for stimulus during the crisis with long-term fiscal sustainability and proved that government can manage budgets while meeting obligations to citizens. Conservatives believe that Obama added more debt than all previous presidents combined, saddled future generations with unsustainable obligations as well. Despite claims of fiscal responsibility, he never proposed a balanced budget and pushed trillion-dollar deficits year after year. His only cuts to the deficit came as emergency spending naturally declined and tax revenues recovered. He expanded entitlements and grew government spending to historic levels while accusing Republicans of fiscal recklessness. And so there you have it. Now, to set the table for the progressive take on all of this, let's hear from the good doctor himself, Cornel West. This clip is just from a year into the Obama presidency. Take a listen.
How deep is your love for poor and working people? Don't be seduced by the elites. I applaud your brilliance. I applaud your charisma. You changed the image of America, but don't simply be the friendly face of the American empire. Many lives hang on your courage, and you cannot do it alone. Like Abraham Lincoln, who needed the abolitionist movement, like FDR, who needed the labor movement, you need a progressive movement to push you. That's what I plan to do, but you have to be receptive. You are in a tough situation. I understand that. But as you recall from the discussion that we had 2 years ago, if you cannot keep alive the legacy of Martin Luther King Jr. and Rabbi Abraham Joshua Heschel and Miles Horton and Dorothy Day and Cesar Chavez in the States and connect it to the empowerment of those Frantz Fanon called the wretched of the earth, you will end up just another colorful caretaker of an empire in decline and a culture in decay.
Given the fact that one of the authoritarian creep issues that we're dealing with today is ICE disappearing people from the streets with masked recruits tormenting cities and neighborhoods under Trump's mass deportation regime, you might wonder why I didn't start there. So let's get that out of the way. The most curious aspect of the Obama administration is the reticence on both the right and the left to talk about the nickname Deporter-in-Chief. For all you kids out there, that's a real thing. Now, in progressive circles, this was Obama's reputation long before Trump 1.0 and kids in cages. The reason the right didn't want to talk about it is because it was kind of their thing. Since he was doing what they only wished they could, there was no margin for them in making it a big issue. And for Democrats, it was one of the biggest instances of Obama blindness. They just didn't want to see it, much like Biden on Gaza. But it's worth talking about it, so let me show you a couple of quick charts before we dig into the policy agenda items one by one. Let's look at 3 back-to-back 8-year terms to get a full picture of what immigration and deportation used to look like in this country and why Obama earned that nickname among progressives. Under Bill Clinton, there was a ton of activity at the U.S.-Mexico border specifically. Remember, this is during the Mexican debt crisis and before NAFTA really took hold. Of the 12.2 million apprehensions, 11 of them were at the U.S.-Mexico border, a stunning amount of activity. And over the 8 years that he was in office, more people were deported than admitted by a slight margin. But the number I want you to focus on is the removals line, rather than the returns, because that's the crucial part here. Returns are people coming across that were intercepted and sent back. Removals represents our deliberate activity to find and deport people who've been living in the country, perhaps illegally, having either crossed without permission or charged with a crime here or in their home country, or maybe overstaying a visa, what have you. So with Clinton as our baseline, let's check out the Bush years. What you'll see here is a significant reduction in the number of people attempting to cross the border as NAFTA is now taking hold in Mexico and their currency and economy begin to stabilize. Even still, it's a pretty big number. But another stretch where more people are sent out of the country than attempt to enter, and the removals figure more than doubles under an even more aggressive GOP. And now, here's Barry, who had to deal with an entirely different economic situation than the prior administrations and still said, "Hold my beer on those removals." You can see from the total number of attempted crossings compared to prior administrations that America wasn't the most desirable place during the financial crisis. And yet, the Obama administration didn't just match the prior administration's person-for-person apprehension to deportation, they removed 1 million more immigrants than Bush and more than 3 times the number under Clinton. Hence, Deporter-in-Chief. And by the way, remember the kids in cages issue under Trump 1.0? Well, those cages were actually built under Obama. Separating families was more of a Trump thing, but it should be noted that Mr. Build That Wall didn't come close to removing the number of immigrants in his first term as Obama did in his first or second term. Now, of course, that's all changing under the white supremacist regime of Stephen Miller, so I have complete faith and confidence that they'll catch up in no time. Now to the policy achievements as acknowledged by both sides of the aisle and the progressive take on them. Apart from Ronald Reagan, no president came into office with as much political capital as Barack Obama. And perhaps it wasn't politically viable no matter how much capital he had, but the Affordable Care Act is neither the success that liberals call it, nor the abomination that conservatives say. Conservatives, in fact, should love it because they wrote it, literally. The original nickname for Obamacare was Romneycare because it was passed into law in Massachusetts under Governor Mitt Romney. The policy was essentially crafted by the Heritage Foundation, the primary authors of Project 2025, because it was a gift to private insurers and a way to stop immigrants, theoretically, from using the emergency room for healthcare. There's only one progressive answer to healthcare coverage in the United States, and that is Medicare for All, which was never considered by Obama. And in fact, a public option was immediately taken off the table. Now, before we get into how he prosecuted the wars in Iraq and Afghanistan, we should also note that the expansion of the surveillance state apparatus in the United States under Obama was dramatic, and so was the loss of civil liberties. Now, in terms of the war efforts themselves, not only did we continue in Iraq for virtually his entire term, we pushed on in Afghanistan after leaked documents showed that we knew all along there was no plan or winnable strategy. So we did no better than the Soviets did, and we just prolonged the inevitable takeover by the Taliban. The troop surge under Obama turned these fiascos from a Bush problem into an Obama problem that only got worse as our neocon forever war strategy just widened to include a regime change in Libya, civil war in Syria, bombing campaigns in Yemen, Pakistan, and Somalia. None of these countries were at war with us. None, which just shows the extent of the executive overreach and the war fever that had gotten into the Oval Office. So according to the ICIJ, Obama racked up more drone strikes in his first year as president than George Bush did over 8 years. Thousands of drone strikes and thousands of airstrikes rained down on the Middle East and Northern Africa under a president who started off his term with a Nobel Peace Prize. Take that, Donald. All told, the Obama administration threw nearly $1 trillion at the global financial crisis during the first term. It was split into 3 areas: state budgets, infrastructure projects, and an extension of social insurance programs. In conjunction with the historic stimulus from the Federal Reserve into the financial markets, it did help stave off a worldwide economic depression. But for the people, this largesse was short-lived under the Larry Summers doctrine of timely, targeted, and temporary. But while the people were ultimately left to their own devices, someone forgot to turn off the spigot to the banking sector and to corporate America. As a result, the bottom 50% of the country barely budged throughout Obama's term, while the top 10% and top 1% experienced massive gains in wealth that have continued unabated since the loose money era. That's because the Obama administration bailed out the banks and put regulations on commercial banks that ultimately constricted lending to the consumer in the small business sector, while allowing the money to just flow into public entities and to the private credit markets, hedge funds, and investment banks. And no one went to jail for putting millions of Americans into bankruptcy. People forget that the Occupy movement didn't take off until 2011. That was well into Obama's first term, and 2 years after the financial crisis, because young people and old radicals woke up to the realization that Obama was just a prettier and more capable face of the same old establishment. Now, there's a persistent myth that Obama wasn't a friend to corporate America, and then there's the reality. And the reality looks a lot like this. Corporate tax rates didn't budge under Obama. The Bush tax cuts stayed where they were, and corporations, especially the public ones, started on a historic run that continues to this very day, though Trump will eventually destroy that run as well. But the bottom line here is the bottom line. And for corporate America, everything was status quo on the tax side, and free money was flowing. And now for the lightning round. The Paris Climate Agreement was great until it was ripped to shreds by his predecessor. Now, is that Obama's fault? Not specifically, but had he used his political capital to do more than performative solar projects and expansion of transition fuels like natural gas, then we would have delivered on authentic initiatives to stimulate a green energy revolution. Instead, they spent 8 years studying the cost of carbon and trying to put a dollar figure on it in white papers so that they could give policy guidance to future administrations to blah, bitty, blah, blah, fucking blah. The reason emissions reduced under Obama, leading him to declare that we had decoupled carbon emissions from GDP growth, was due to the boom in natural gas and fracking. It just burns cleaner than oil and coal, but the extraction process leads to entirely different environmental issues. The Iran nuclear deal was great until it too was ripped to shreds by his predecessor. Now, is that Obama's fault? Not specifically, but hindsight's 2020. And if we had understood the region better and converted from a bloodthirsty, oil-hungry posture to a regional development stance, we would have seen the natural alliances that existed and seen opportunities to foster growth, especially with the election of Rouhani in Iran in 2013. But we spent so much time, money, and ammunition bombing the shit out of everyone for literally no reason, especially anyone that didn't pertain to 9/11, that we couldn't see the opportunities right in front of us. So instead, we did a deal that could be easily ripped up by a hostile American regime. DACA protections, great, terrific. How are those kids doing today? Temporary protections extended, and nothing to fucking show for it except that these kids are now adults and they're being terrorized by Stephen Miller's private Gestapo. Now, in terms of fiscal management, here's where the GOP can truly suck it. Obama legitimately inherited the worst financial crisis since Hoover, and his initial policy response was outstanding. Flood the market with liquidity, prop up the states, backstop the people, stop the bleeding, and start building shit. But then the stuff for us stopped. But the gifts to corporate America and the banks didn't. So in terms of deficit management, you can see here for yourself that after the initial spike to the economy and put it all back together, Obama ran a tight ship and then started reining in the deficits. And then Trump uncorked it all and built them right back up, leading us into COVID. No one has run larger, more consistent deficits than Donald fucking Trump. But it isn't about him, right? This is about Obama, who is a very tough fiscal manager. And that's why Republicans should admire him. It's why liberals proudly display him. And it's why progressives just can't get over it. The drones, expansion of the surveillance state, closing the door on universal health care by literally handing the keys to private insurers, the continuation of endless wars, extending temporary status for DACA kids but not pulling it over the finish line, and attempting to balance the budget without extracting the pound of flesh from the corporate class that they deserved and we deserved. In other words, by protecting the wealthy corporate interests above all else and hoping the free market would work its magic over time. The perfect classical Republican playbook that always ends the same way. And now here's where I'll allow a lot of grace, a considerable amount of grace. A few things in defense of President Obama. He was technocratic, and I value that. His administration was incredibly competent. We should all value that. The American Rescue Plan, while insufficient, was administered smoothly and without instances of fraud. And in fact, it was Joe Biden who oversaw this personally. Obama recognized the importance of the internet as an economic tool and passed net neutrality in 2015 to reclassify it as a utility. He pushed to pass the Lilly Ledbetter Fair Pay Act, which hasn't narrowed the pay gap, but it did extend statutes of limitations to bring pay equity cases and a legal rationale to prevail in the courts. He was a proper statesman and a phenomenal example to a new generation just getting involved in politics. He brought a sense of style, grace, and compassion to the Oval Office that seems almost foreign and quaint these days. And he maintained a sense of calm and composure even as the Tea Party formed to smear him and the Republican Party engaged in a campaign of obstruction, the likes of which that we haven't seen since John Calhoun. The window of opportunity for transformational and generational progressive change was probably about 18 to 20 months at best. The racist instincts of a defeated GOP were only dormant for so long, and so ultimately, the party revealed its true self through the block everything the black guy does position that it took. Mitch McConnell even said it out loud, saying that the entire GOP platform was to make Obama a one-term president. They were going to lay their lives on the line to halt any progress under Obama. And so We were only ever going to get what we got in those first 2 years. You know what I mean? So does that absolve Barack Obama of his centrism and corporatism? Absolutely not. Because if Donald Trump has shown us anything, it's that you can do just about anything when you have the desire and the political capital to do so. And for a moment, while the liberal establishment was basking in their own self-satisfaction for breaking a racial barrier, they forgot that the fight had only just begun. Voices like Cornel West were shunned, and furiously so. He was called a traitor to his race by remaining consistent and true to his tradition. To liberals, Barack Obama was the hope and change. But to progressives, we were hoping that he could bring change. And in a way, I guess he did. By firmly defending the status quo, he ushered in the biggest change this country has ever seen. The job of progressives won't be done until we've normalized Medicare for all as much as they've normalized drone strikes and mass surveillance and violent deportations, until the bottom 50% of this country sees increases in wealth as staggering as the top 1% has, until we stop being self-satisfied just because we elected a black man to the White House. Barack Obama was the most qualified person in that race, but we allowed him to succumb to the status quo. Now, there's no question that he personally embodies family values. He loves his wife and children more than anything. He remains devoted to his faith. He was certainly tough on crime, ruthless on the border, and an expansive commander-in-chief. He partnered with the business community and protected them every step of the way, no matter what the GOP wants to say about it. He was a believer in the free markets, that they would eventually deliver prosperity for the poor and the working class. He was fiscally responsible and made sure to keep taxes nice and low. And he could devour a hot dog at a barbecue with the best of them, even under the withering and disapproving glare of his wife. So very relatable, so very American. Like I said, the greatest Republican president of my lifetime. Here endeth the lesson. Well, hey, thanks for sticking around. You know, we just kicked off our fall Fund, Friend, and Hellraiser period, so make sure you go to UNFTR to find out how to get involved and consider becoming a member of the show. We're entirely member-supported. We don't take ads or sponsor revenue, so if you love what we do here, then you have these fine folks to thank.
This is the story of a political pundit who looked at the world around him and just said, fuck it. Gives the middle finger to authority and says, kiss my ass. But instead of a revolution, he started a podcast. Just what the world needs.